Good morning. It's great to be with you. I hope you're having a great morning wherever you are. As Steve said in the announcements, we are kicking off a new service this week. It's called Back to the Future. I think the idea is predicated on if you don't learn the lessons from the past, then you're doomed to repeat the past. Plus, I guess the idea that the characters that we find throughout Scripture have plenty to teach us about the journey of faith. This morning we're looking at Abraham. Abraham's a seminal figure in the history not just of Israel but of the world. He's claimed by Judaism, Islam and Christianity, and he's mentioned more in the New Testament than any other figure. In the Bible's Hall of Fame in Hebrews 11, we're given a series of snapshots of people whose faith stand out in Old Testament history like stars on a dark night. And the writer of Hebrews gives almost half the space in that Hall of Fame to Abraham, more than twice the space that is allocated to Moses. Abraham in the book of Genesis stands on a fault line. We first see him in chapter 11, and by verse 30 of chapter 11, all the efforts of humanity to improve all their wickedness, all those events wind up with this line from Adam being barren. Out of that barrenness, God calls. And out of that barrenness, God blesses. And in so doing, provides a template, not just for the history of Israel, but for us as well. I think it's tempting when we look at Abraham's life to assume that with a resume like the one that's listed in Hebrews 11, that Abraham popped out of the womb fully formed in his relationship with God, with a faith that was strong and consistent and constant. But if that's the case, we'd be doing him and our God a significant disservice. See, when all we look at it is at the end of the process, we miss the value of the journey. Now, the account of Abraham's life kicks off when he's about 75 years old, and it follows him for the next 100 years or so. And so this morning, we're going to do 100 years in about 25 minutes, 30 minutes thereabouts. He started his life with a name that mocked him. Abram means exalted father. And yet, as I said, when we pick him up in Genesis 11 verse 30, we see this 75-year-old guy was childless. He's not introduced as being a particularly good or moral man. Noah, at least in the Genesis story, was introduced as being righteous. What we do know about Abraham early on in the piece is that he came from the line of Shem. He was one of Noah's boys. He was a native of Mesopotamia, specifically of a city called Ur, which is in present-day Iraq, about 300 km from the site of where Babylon was. And life for Abraham in Ur would have been pretty comfortable. In his time, it was a bustling seaport where trade was conducted with India and Africa. The city was a centre of intellectual activity, and the region was well suited for raising flocks and herds. However, it was not all beer and skittles or wine and hummus or whatever they ate in those days and did. Ur had a dark side, as most cities did at that time. It was a place where pagan sacrifice, including human sacrifice, abounded. And Joshua 24 verse 2 indicates that Abraham's old man, Terah, was an idol worshipper. And in fact, some Jewish traditions say that he actually made idols for a living. Although how much stock you put in that is up for argument. Abraham's father, Terah, has this vision to head to Canaan, but he only gets about halfway, is on the journey to Haran. According to Genesis 12, while they are at Haran, Abram receives this call from God to leave his father's house and complete the journey. Genesis 12 verse 1. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people and your father's household to the land I'll show you. I will make you into a great nation and I will bless you. I will make your name great and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So, Abram, Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his nephew, to use John Calvin's term, they pack up their stuff and they leave Haran with closed eyes to follow the call of God. I'm a little in awe of Abram's response. his life was going well. It was comfortable. All right, he didn't have kids, but the rest of it seemed to be going all right. And then God, who there's no indication that Abraham actually knew, out of nowhere clears his divine throat and speaks to this man. A man who had a background of, came from a background of idol worshippers. And Abram's response is yes. He never asks the question, why, or where, or for what, or how. And the thing that gets me about this is this had never been done before. Abram didn't know anything about God, about Yahweh. He didn't have a Google Maps to read from on the journey to Canaan. I want you to hear and feel the tension of this call because it flows throughout Abram's story and by extension our story as well. Walter Brueggemann put it this way. He said, the whole of the Abrahamic narrative is premised on this seeming contradiction. To stay in safety is to remain barren. To leave in risk is to have hope. Abram's journey hinges on this yes moment. The future blessing that he was to be part of hinges on this moment. The journey before them was one of uncertainty and danger. He had no idea where the journey was going to take him, just to a land that Yahweh would show him. And he could have stayed in his comfort bubble in Haran. Following that promise involves risk. Jesus put it this way, for whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. See, the reality is Abram's call is our call. Not to become a father of nations and all that stuff, but to follow God where he leads us, to leave our past behind and let him take us on a journey. And we don't know exactly what the end of the journey looks like, but the call is to the journey. See, you and I are no different. Life in my little bubble can be pretty comfortable. It can be risk-free. But God's purpose for my life is too big to fit into my comfort zone. I can't remain in my comfort zone and hope I'll be able to serve God's purpose. I must leave my average behind to experience God's extraordinary. And just like Abraham, God doesn't give me all the details when he wants me to do something for him. He asks me to step out in obedience, to respond in trust. The good news is the Bible assures us that the God who calls us is faithful and will see us through. Paul wrote this to the church at Philippi. He said, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. I love that because the focus is then not on my faithfulness and how good I can be and whether I get everything right, but on our Heavenly Father's faithfulness, on his goodness, on his ability to carry us through. So maybe one of the questions that we need to wrestle with this morning that Abraham would ask us is, what is God waiting for you to say yes to? Where has he asked you to step out of your comfort zone but you've been resisting? Are you exchanging your average for God's extraordinary? Where is the promise you need to return to? Maybe it's about finding ways to love people even in the midst of a lockdown. Maybe, and this is a big one, it's about him waiting for you to say yes to you finally letting go of yourself and letting him take control of your life. Maybe it's that first blush where you decide, you know what? I'm going to take a step on this faith journey and see where it leads. I don't have all the answers, but I'll trust God to bring me through. Now, even though Abraham starts well, he says yes to the call of God. That doesn't mean he has this whole faith bag sorted out. His journey is not one of up and to the right. Over the next 25 to 30 years, we see Abram struggle with who is really in charge of his life. And his journey is a little bit like a waveform. He has ups and downs. He has moments of sublime faith and clarity where he responds in obedience. And then there are others where, let's be honest, he'd probably like to have them back again. See, from the perspective of history, there is no doubt that Abraham's faith is among the strongest in the Bible. However, as strong as his faith might have been, he is still human, subject to frailties and weaknesses, subject to fear. He's learning that God can be trusted. He's learning that God is up to his word. And that has ups and downs with it. Before our kids came along, Steph and I were exploring permanent care and adoption as a means of growing our family. And during one of the education sessions that we had to do before we could get on the list, there was a presentation by a psychologist who talked about the hard time kids from difficult backgrounds have in responding to events the way kids from healthy backgrounds do, and will often try to sabotage them. He explained that birthday parties, while a thing of great joy for a kid from a normal, healthy family background, can be a great thing, that birthday parties for a kid from an abusive background can be a thing of sheer terror. And to help bring the point home, to help drive it home, what he did was he showed us a video with two different types of music. In the first video, we were given, we were shown a journey down a narrow, sandy, tropical path with lots of trees and brush, and it was gorgeous. And that path twisted and turned, and eventually it opened up onto a beautiful beach. And the music in the background was relaxing. It was sort of islanderish, so there were ukuleles, and you could hear birds and you could hear the waves, and it was just nice. And you really could. You could feel yourself just sort of sink into your seat a little bit while you're watching this and really relax. Then he played the video again, the exact same video, except this time the music was the theme from Jaws. So it was that dun-dun-dun-dun, dun-dun-dun-dun, and it built. And I could feel myself getting more tense each time we went around the corner. I could feel myself leaning forward in my seat, trying to see where the danger was coming from. And by the time we hit the beach, just as that the attack music gets to its crescendo, where it's that dun 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 dun, I was expecting to be attacked by something. The psychologist called it hearing shark music. And I think this is something akin to what was going on in Abram during this period. He would look at situations and assume that God had abandoned him, or would fail to bail him out, or wasn't in control, and he would hear shark music, and he would try and take charge, or he would make a dumb choice. Let me show you what I mean. Genesis 12:6. Abram has left his father's household. He travels to Shechem in Canaan, which is a journey of about 900 where God had promised to give the land to Abram and his family. And he moves around this promised land. The problem was that the land, about 4 verses later, the land is hit by famine. So Abram leaves the land God had given him and heads for Egypt. Abram abandons God's plan and makes up his own. Now that's never a good idea, famine or not. There's a technical term for this. It's called a stupid plan. When Abram gets to Egypt, people start noticing how incredibly beautiful Abram's wife Sarai was. Abram had to come up with a plan. This guy was in fear of his life. Well, because who wouldn't want to kill him to be with her? Now, guys, I'm going to stop just for 2 minutes. This is the bit where you turn to your wives and you say, I know exactly what he's going through. Go, do it. You feel free to do that right now, and you can thank me later for the brownie points. The thing is, while he's in Egypt, Abraham's hearing shark music. He's in unfamiliar land. Is God in charge? Will God's protection last now that he's left the promised land? He's in trouble. So he comes up with a stupid plan. Again, this is the technical phrase for plans that are not God's. He decides to lie, and he tells everyone that Sarai is his sister. Sarai is so beautiful that Pharaoh actually takes her into his personal harem. God at this point decides to bail Abram out, and he inflicts Pharaoh and his family with plagues. Pharaoh gives Sarai back, and Abraham heads back to Canaan, where God wanted him to be in the first place. But it was shark music that drove that decision. In Genesis 15, we see the same process play out with more significant catastrophic results. In Genesis 15, God once again renews his covenant to Abram. God promises that he will provide a child from Abram and Sarai. That will be an heir to the nations. And like the call, Abram's first answer is brilliant. It's his epitaph. Abram believed the Lord and he credited it to him as righteousness. And then he falls asleep and he has this dream where God reveals to him the substance of his promise and renews his covenant with Abraham. There's a saying that one day you're a rooster and the next you're a feather duster. Abraham's rooster moment is this night. This is one of the pinnacles of his faith journey. It's a high point in the waveform of his faith. But it's amazing how quickly the feather duster moment comes. See, the promise is good. The promise is great. But what do you do if God's taking too long to fulfill it? I think this is where the shark music kicks up in Abraham again. Because he decides to go along with a plan to give God a hand. Time passes. The promise is not fulfilled instantly. Sarai doesn't conceive. They knew this was going to happen. She's old. What was God thinking? God can't do that. Surely this is not the way it's meant to be. The promise is there. I want God to look good. I'm going to try and help fulfill it. This has all the hallmarks of another one of these stupid plans. Genesis 16. This is about 9 years or so after he'd initially said yes to God. Sarai comes up with the plan to help God, along with this whole child thing. They decide to get Abram a concubine and have a child through her. Hagar was her name. Now, on one hand, this was pretty normal practice in their time. The problem is what the action belies underneath. The problem was they'd begun to doubt the promise again because God was not working to their time frame. John Calvin calls their faith defective. See, the truth is that a life of faith, a journey of faith, is not easy. It calls for resistance to the shark music which says that God is not going to come through this time. It calls for believing in a gift from God where none of the present data can substantiate the idea that that gift is coming. Let me ask this morning, what music do you hear in your head when it feels like God is taking his time fulfilling a promise to you? Or when a setback comes along? What's the soundtrack? Is it God's going to come through, or is it God's going to fail me? What issues in your life make you hear shark music? Is it around themes of acceptance or control? Or who's in charge? Or forgiveness? Or grace? Can I suggest this morning two things? I think times like we're in, these periods of lockdown, they can trigger shark music events more readily and from out of nowhere than we're used to. The other thing is, sometimes all it does is just turn the volume up a little bit these times. If you've been listening to shark music over the last couple of weeks, or you can recognise this pattern in your life, it's time. You need to allow God to change the soundtrack of your life. It's after this event, after this mistake, this stupid decision, that God decides Abram needs some positive reinforcement. God decides to change Abram's name to Abraham, father of many, and Sarai's name to Sarah, which means princess. And in the fullness of time, a baby of promise, not a baby of human ingenuity, is born. God is not slow as some understand slow, but he does work to his own timetable, not ours. And we need to be doing that journey with him not trying to help out in that sense. One of the things I find incredibly encouraging about Abraham's story is that these ups and downs, these mistakes, these stupid decisions, these good responses, the whole mixed bag have not disqualified Abraham from walking with God. What they've done is they've prepared him for the most important moment of his life. The story unfolds throughout Genesis 22 to 25, and it is the climax of Abraham's story. The language in the story is urgent. The language afterwards is much more relaxed. 25 years into this man's walk with God, 25 years after saying yes to Yahweh, a son's born, a child of promise. His name is Isaac. And I'm sure that Abraham and Sarah celebrated as only 100-year-olds can, with a good afternoon nap. Not just because of the baby, but because God has fulfilled his promise to them. You'd think that's the happy ending. If I was writing a story, that's where I'd want to stop. God's come through, they've learnt a lesson, now we can all live happily ever after. But the supreme test of Abraham's faith was yet to come. Tests that would destroy us in our immaturity often prove our faith as we mature. So it was with Abraham. When Isaac had reached his early teens, we reckon, God told Abraham to do a strange thing. One day, God says to Abraham, and this is in Genesis chapter 22, verse 2, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, who you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I'll show you." There is something jarring about that. That's an astounding thing to hear. Abraham is to take the promised son, on whom all the promises of God for the future of Abraham depend, and offer him as a human sacrifice on the altar of distant mountains. It's worth stopping and just recognising the parallel here of the Abraham of old. God speaks to the old man of faith out of the blue and asks him to go on a journey. No questions. And Abraham responds the same way that he did all those years previously. The difference this time is that there's no wavering of faith. There is no doubt in Abraham about God's character or ability. There is no Abraham listening to shark music and trying to take charge. The shark music is silent. A new song plays. A song that says God is in charge, that he is good to his word, that he keeps his promises. So the next morning he gets up and he takes 2 guys with him, plus his son Isaac, and as well as the wood for the offering. And he begins the journey. And on that 3rd day, they get near the place for the sacrifice. When Isaac asks this searching question, he says, "The fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them went on together. Notice here, Abraham doesn't sugarcoat it. He doesn't tell Isaac everything that he wants to know. He can't. Because he himself doesn't know. He's in a position where he trusts God unreservedly, where he trusts God to fulfill his promise, to keep his word. There is no holding back here. This is 100% commitment. When they come to the place, Abraham apparently had to tell Isaac what he was about to do, and Isaac, being a strong young man, had to be willing to be bound on the altar as God had directed Abraham. And just as Abraham takes the knife to take the life of his own son, God stays his hand and tells him to offer instead a ram caught in a thicket nearby. Hebrews expresses it this way. This is from the Hall of Fame, chapter 11. By faith, Abraham, when God, I've done something weird with my text there. By faith, Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "Through Isaac, your promised offspring shall come." He was about to follow through in obedience, absolute obedience. At the last moment, a messenger of God calls out to Abraham, "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you've not withheld from me your son, your only son." And Abraham looks up, sees a ram, and offers the ram instead. I think this incident with Isaac reveals more clearly than any other the maturity of Abraham's faith. As stated again in Hebrews, Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. Abraham's had such confidence in God that he believed that out of the ashes of the sacrificed Isaac, consumed as a burnt offering, he would be restored in resurrection to his father to fulfill the promises of God. And we see that before they went up the mountain. Genesis 22 verse 5, I've sort of emphasised it on the screen so you can see. "Stay here with the donkey," Abraham told the servants. "The boy and I will travel a little further. We will worship there, and then we will come right back." Abraham's not trying to help God here. Abraham's just taking it a step at a time in obedience. While I was doing some reading for this message, I came across two words I love, and to be honest, I've been trying to work out ways to shoehorn them into the message, so I've just decided to do it blatantly now. The two words were shlemiel and shlemozel. A shlemiel is someone who goes around, it's a Hebrew word, it means someone who goes around spilling soup on people. A shlemozel is the one who has soup spilled onto them. And I think as I look at Abraham's life, I see times as I look at the waveform of his faith where he was a shlemiel, where he made silly decisions because he couldn't bring himself to trust God on the journey. And he spilled soup on people, on Sarai, on Hagar and Ishmael, on Pharaoh, on Abimelech, which is a story we didn't talk about. But then I also see a man who was a shlemozel, who at different times had soup through no fault of his own spilt on him. God calls him out of the blue to leave his father's house, and he responds. God asks him to endure circumcision as an adult man, and he responds positively. Other people make bad decisions, and he gets soup spilt on him. But the thing is, whether he was a shlemiel or a shlemozel, God's faithfulness endured throughout the journey. And as you look at your life, whether you say, "I've mostly been a shlemiel" or "I've mostly been a shlemozel," God has been with you every step of that journey. And those incidences that you would like to get back don't disqualify you from walking with him now. Abraham's call in some ways is ours, to step out in obedience and follow God, even though we don't know the end of the journey. See, I think Abraham was ultimately a man of faith who believed he could live in God's place, who believed in God's provision for him in time and eternity, who believed the promise of the Son who God would give him miraculously, and who believed in God's divine power of resurrection. Our faith today stands on that same foundation. Like Abraham, we're called to live a life by faith in the living God who will accomplish for us in time and eternity all that he has promised in love and grace. We don't always know how that journey goes on. We don't always like some of the individual incidents. But I want to encourage you with the words of Psalm 35 verse 7 this morning. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in him, and he will act. We're like Abraham. We struggle sometimes to believe the promises of God when reality seems to be all but designed to make life difficult. Thankfully, God's faithful towards us is more consistent and constant than ours is towards God. Abraham, the father of all who have faith, was a human like you and I. He was a flawed character who messed up more than he'd like to admit. He was subject to the same doubts and fears. However, as he walked with God, as he learned to walk in obedience, his faith, his trust in God became bigger than his doubts. The encouragement this morning is the same for you in your journey. Let your trust in God become bigger than your doubts. Because we have a God who is faithful, who will see the work to the end and will complete his good work in us. Why don't we take a minute and we'll just pray and then we'll finish our service. Lord, this morning, as we reflect on the story of Abraham, we hear you calling us to leave our comfort zone, to leave Haran and head on a journey. We don't know where that journey leads. We don't know how it ends. And we don't always know what will be asked of us on that journey. But this morning, we take a chance and we reaffirm that yes, we're going to follow. Yes, we're going to step out in obedience. Yes, we're going to trust you to bring us through. Lord, where we hear shark music, where doubts and fears start to rise up, would you turn up the music of faith, the music of perseverance, the music of your love for us? And Lord, would you help us trust you to bring us to a mature faith in time and in place according to your good will. Amen.